Good afternoon, colleagues and guests, and of course to you, Home Secretary. You're most welcome at our annual conference. Home Secretary, you hold one of the most important offices of state and are charged with keeping our country and its people safe. My association has always enjoyed a productive relationship with your predecessors and with your officials. Now, I believe this is important, and I can assure you that my association will always endeavour to nurture that good relationship. We may not agree on every issue, but I think the hallmarks of a healthy relationship are respecting each other's perspectives, valuing each other's expertise, and working transparently together. I also believe it's important that my colleagues, once a year, hear directly from their Home Secretary. It reinforces that we all have the same goals: to serve the public and keep them safe. So I hope you find our conference a positive and valuable experience. Now, I stand before you this afternoon with some mixed emotions and thoughts. This will be the final time I address you, my colleagues, as your president at our conference. The last 2.5 years have gone so quickly. Change has been a constant throughout my tenure. At the highest political levels, we have seen the EU referendum, a new Prime Minister, and a general election, and changes to the Cabinet, as well as the new mayoral system across the country, new police and crime commissioners, changes at Chief Constable level, changes to crime patterns, changes to budgets. As I say, change is a constant. What has also been a constant is the relentless increase of pressure upon the police service in this time. We have seen this manifested in capacity, demand, and people. Put bluntly, policing is now utterly reliant on fewer people working longer and harder. For our members, this has resulted in a major increase in expectations on you. Bigger commands, both in size and scope. More complexity, more risk, and more demand. Smaller teams, fewer resources, less support. And as I've stated on many occasions, your tireless commitment to getting the job done, whatever the consequences for you. Our most recent resilience survey, completed by 75% of superintendents in England and Wales, provided the most worrying set of results since we started doing this survey in 2010. 50% of you have signs of anxiety, 27% of you symptoms of depression, 59% of you on call on your rest days, 94% of you working or contactable on holiday, and only 27% of you say you have sufficient resources to do the job properly. I want to acknowledge your contribution, your passion, and the way you live our values to serve the public as members of the best policing service in the world. I also want to set out what we, as an association, are doing about this situation. Now, I've previously welcomed the Home Office announcement of £7.5 million funding for a national wellbeing service. We are working closely with them on the development of this service and to ensure that the superintendent's perspective, as a rank and as senior leaders in the service, is well represented to ministers. I'm also on the steering group of the Police Minister's Frontline Review. You'll have heard from the Minister that this is an important initiative to represent the views from the ground and ensure that valuable experience and insight informs policy making and decisions. Your association has also been highlighting the pressures and strains many of you experience every day trying to make collaborations work. Our Vice President, Paul Griffiths, spoke to you this morning about the work he has led on, asking you and our colleagues their views and experiences on collaboration. 96% of you stated that you had to invest more of your time in negotiating and influencing than you would in your previous force role to try and make it work, and that it had an adverse effect on how you lead on these collaborative roles, your private life and health and well-being. What that says to me is that we're trying to make collaborations work when the evidence suggests that this is a suboptimal approach to reform. This is the same conclusion that the HMIC said in 2005, yet we're still trying to do this with the hope for a different outcome. And 82% of you agreed that forced amalgamations should be considered as a more effective governance arrangement. Now, we're also revisiting the work from 3 years ago into public protection, which found 82% of those leading these commands had received no training for it. I'm grateful to the College of Policing for taking forward the licence to practice work around this, but a repeat of our research has found that currently 87% of our colleagues leading in protecting children and the vulnerable are being placed in positions with no training or development. The report, which I will be issuing soon, is based on a response rate of 100% of all my colleagues who lead in child protection. Their professional views and voice, I believe, are important and ignored at our peril. They describe what is a wider issue in this service, of one in crisis with no end in sight to the quandary of demand versus resource and capacity. We need to start thinking longer term for the public protection. We need a vision and a different approach in the longer term across this country. Now, this is not me saying this, but our colleagues trying to lead and deliver a service in crisis. Another key concern you highlighted are the hours you're working, and we're addressing this too. As many of you will know, your National Secretary, Dan Murphy, is exploring the role of working time regulations, which are set out in law to protect people's health. With the welcome support of Sarah Thornton, I wrote in June to all Chief Constables asking about their compliance with the working time regulation requirements. There is a legal requirement for any employer to have a sufficiently effective means for people to record the hours they work. The response from forces highlighted that for the majority in the superintending ranks, there was no proper oversight of the hours they are working, that accurate records are not being kept, and that the excessive hours that they are working is a real effect on your health and well-being. Now, I'll make 2 points here. Firstly, if our ambition is to move from a time-served pay structure to one that reflects the individual's contribution and roles, then a fundamental element of this is knowing how many hours your people are working and what they're doing in that time. Secondly, I believe that the information and analysis of people's working patterns will evidence that the current operating models are only achievable if you and your teams continue to work harder and longer. Clearly, this is unsustainable. As a service, we must make the case ahead of the next comprehensive spending review. But this is just not about me as your president, pointing out to Chief Constables and the Home Office their responsibilities. Many of you will also have heard me challenge ourselves as leaders in the service. We have a responsibility now and tomorrow to change our behaviour and our language and help those we lead to do the same, to break the cycle of long hours and presenteeism, to bust the dangerous myth that you can only be a good performer if you work long hours. We are police officers. We joined to serve the public. It goes without saying that we will always give extra of ourselves, especially in emergencies and operational situations. But firstly, I can assure you that policing will not fall apart because someone needed to have a day off sick or to take a rest day. So please, for your own health and that of your teams, demonstrate by your leadership that presenteeism is not the norm. Secondly, and more importantly, I cannot emphasize enough that the delivery of routine policing functions should not be dependent on officers effectively giving their time for free, staying past their shift times, or working on leave days. Home Secretary, that exploits officers and it defrauds the public. This brings me neatly to the subject of pay and the wider pay setting process. It was this government and the then Home Secretary that insisted on moving from a police negotiating board to an independent remuneration review body. And it has been this government that has thus far ignored the evidence-based recommendations of the PRRB, making their own decisions on pay awards for policing. Home Secretary, I really do need to make it clear to you that officers feel let down by this. We're not asking for much. None of us joined the police service to be rich. In fact, the personal resilience survey I referred to earlier amply demonstrates this. More than 90% of my colleagues still feel that serving the public is a vocation. But there is a fundamental principle of procedural justice at stake here. We have no industrial rights, and nor do we want them. All our faith and trust is in the PRRB process. And when we have a government that has consistently ignored this process, where do we go? For the past 2 years, policing has been given some of the lowest pay awards out of all the public services and put in the frankly immoral position of making chief constables choose between giving their staff the pay rise they were awarded or cutting staff numbers. Home Secretary, it is simply and unequivocally unfair. I urge you and the government to look again at the pay process and the recommendations of the pay review body, as the least police officers should be able to expect is for these to be fit for purpose. If I can turn now to the current pay reform and its approach to move from a time served to one that remunerates for the complexity and breadth of a role and the skills of the person performing it. We're supportive of this, provided the new model is consistent, transparent, and equitable across England and Wales, and that none of you are worse off than you are now. But the evidence suggests this will be a challenge for a service consisting of 43 different organisations who will each approach it differently. I can recall the inconsistency of the big job allowance across forces, and more recently the bonus payments recommended by PRRB 2016-17, which have yet to be enacted, and more so in any consistent way across forces. The challenge of consistency and transparency on pay reform across 43 organisations could be nearly as complex as Brexit. Okay, maybe not quite. But the 2018 PRRB report, and I quote, "We note that there are inherent structural problems in having to secure the necessary commitment from each of the 43 separate and independent police forces. And to the extent that the MPCC is in a position to supply the collective leadership required in order to deliver the vision, we were not convinced that there was a willingness to exercise the necessary authority to drive the work forward." Now, I suggest there are two core principles that are key to achieving pay reform. A move away from restricting our thinking and approach to the current pay envelope. If we're going to be truly innovative and reforming in this, then let's write the letter first and see if it fits the envelope. The alternative is an approach of diminishing return, if reform is continually restricted to what is affordable. Whatever is proposed, all of us must be confident that it has the confidence and that it has been achieved in an open and transparent and inclusive manner. It needs to bring the workforce with it. Now, the challenges of implementing pay reform fairly in 43 different organisations is yet another example of how the current structure of policing is far from ideal. I referred earlier to the pressures many of you are facing in collaborations work or in dealing with divorce arrangements when they do not. Let me describe a picture to you. A police service that is operating short of 13,500 officers. The beat system of neighbourhood policing is largely broken, and this is being acutely felt in the metropolis, the West Midlands, the industrial north, and many county forces. There has been an alarming increase in many crime types in a society where technology is driving rapid change. There is a haphazard approach to uniformity or consistency within the service. A great deal is out of date in both structure and systems, with one expert describing the basis of policing as echoing, and I quote, "not only the requirements of policing a century ago, but also the fears and prejudices, as well as the political wisdom of the Victorian age." This sounds something like 2018. In fact, it is the assessment of the 1962 Royal Commission. We have been debating our structures for delivering service to the public on and off ever since, and yet over the years have been trying to make the same systems and structures work. This, in my judgment, has become even more acute in this century with technology, different expectations from the public, and austerity. The famous definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Structural reform is difficult. It's riven with self-interest and made worse by the current arrangements of localism. One of the consequences of our current system and structures is inconsistency. You only have to review the inspection reports by HMIC FRS to see the term inconsistency is unsurprisingly consistent across many of the findings into forces. Now, I can accept local initiative and nuances to policing. After all, that is how we innovate and develop new and best practice. But surely it is simpler to have 6 or 8 conversations and arrangements for consistency than 43. Policing is essential to the safety and security of our fellow citizens and communities. I have said before, and I will say it again, I cannot accept inconsistency in how we protect our children and vulnerable adults and other critical areas of policing where lives may be at stake. But of course, this is only one of the many challenges facing policing. The current approach is reform through the Police Reform and Transformation Board. Much is reliant on this, but will it be the panacea we hope for? Last year at conference, I called for a conversation, a review of policing in the 21st century where there has been an industrialization of crimes such as internet fraud and child sexual abuse. What do we want our policing service to do? And then once we understand the answer or answers, to then address how we structure our systems and resource them accordingly. We already had an attempt at this through the work of the National Debate Advisory Group, which I was part of in 2015. We came to 5 core principles, which I suggest still hold true now. 1, protect the public, especially the most vulnerable. 2, deliver a service that is valued and supported by the public, tailoring it to be more victim-focused. 3, protect the ease of access to frontline services, including online access and a visible local presence. 4, enhance the capabilities in the service and achieve value for money by scaling up specialist capabilities and standardizing functions. And 5th, last, work in close cooperation with other organizations with greater integration. Now, if we can agree these principles, some of which are being addressed through the Police Reform and Transformation Board, then this is at least a start. The alternative is carrying on as we are, hoping for different outcomes from the same attempts. Euphemisms that are being used to describe the current state of policing include stretched, challenged, degraded, difficult. In my speech last year, I introduced my own by stating that policing was in the middle of a perfect storm. I still hold to that statement. In fact, I would now suggest that this great service is on the verge of crisis in many areas. I recognize that this is not language that the president of the Police Superintendents Association uses often. It's worth reflecting on what the word crisis actually means. The dictionary definition of crisis is a time of intense difficulty or danger, a time when a difficult or important decision must be made. From what my members tell me, from what I've seen and heard in forces in my national role, and from my own experiences, I believe it is reasonable to apply this definition to policing. I want to be clear that I do not say this lightly. I do not say this for headlines, and I do not say it to be controversial. I say it because I have a genuine fear for the future of the police service and the hard-working people who make up this service. I've talked about the impact of the pressure on the service on our members' health and welfare, and about fewer officers needing to work longer and harder, not just to keep up with what is asked of them. We can also see in the headlines of examples where the public feel policing hasn't been there for them, where they feel we have let them down. Believe me, nothing hurts a police officer more than this. We have seen how stretched policing is when called to resource national demand, such as the visit by the President of the United States. We have seen how tired and disillusioned many officers are. But this is only part of the picture. Most of the good that policing does every day goes unreported or unsung, but it is too much of the picture already and is getting bigger. We need a new direction. I suggest based on those 5 principles I mentioned earlier. But to have a new direction, we need to understand what our service will be facing in the future. You will recall last year I spoke of developing a strategic foresight program for the service that can start to do just that. So policing can rise out of the short-term cycles of current demand and stop operating futures blind. Since then, I've been grateful to the support from many organisations, including the Home Office, the Police Foundation and UCL to develop this. I've been particularly grateful to our College of Policing, who have picked this up now and are developing such a programme for the service that can influence those sat in this room in the future of the risks, threats and challenges policing will be facing. This is important. It requires selfless leadership to develop practices and ideas that go beyond one's own tenure and not be obsessed with a personal legacy that is both short-term and short-sighted. The Policing Minister has called on the whole system in policing, including the Home Office, to work together on this, and I agree. However, knowing what the future might hold is only one half of the equation. We must also address the elephant in the room, that there's a void in a long-term strategic vision for the police service of the future. We need to know what the overall goal is for reform. What are we ultimately working towards? What is the vision for policing in the 21st century for England and Wales? It has to be something more strategic than a hope for more collaborations based on individual strategic relationships, the ever-present net donor syndrome, and the fragile sustainability that has been evident over the last decade. Otherwise, we're going to continue to be in a perpetual state of crisis. Localism is a model for those local, valued policing services in communities and neighbourhoods. But it is not a model that can sustain consistent, effective services across regional and national arrangements in delivering strategic, specialist capabilities and practices. So we need a new, clear, and bold direction and vision. To paraphrase your words earlier this year, Home Secretary, we need a government that gets this and is prepared to take those difficult, bold political decisions to reform this service. I'm afraid this has been sadly absent from the whole police reform agenda so far, and I urge you to redress this, to provide a common agreed picture for policing that we can all unite behind and work towards. Because right now, I question who actually has the overview of this system. Who has the picture on the box, the wiring diagram? The College of Policing can have a critical role here. I think it has the potential to be the most important part of this ecosystem. I've seen the college grow and transform from the ashes of the MPIA into an organisation introducing challenging reform and leading on developing us as a profession. I implore everyone in our system to ensure that the College of Policing remains and is sustainable far beyond any of us in this room. Allow it to have the time and space to develop like other professional colleges have had, rather than fall victim to the cycle of changes that have blighted our service over the years. Colleagues, as I said, this is my last conference, both as your president and as a member of our association. It has been a fantastic, exciting, personal journey for me, from being Police Constable 273, stepping out on his first patrol in 1982, to being a detective over the last 3 decades, and witnessing the incredible changes this service has undergone. The job is the people. All of us in this room, and the many colleagues we have worked with over the years, some sadly not with us anymore. They are what make it. Look after them, look after each other. Policing is built on people, and we forsake them at our peril. I could not be more prouder to have been given the opportunity to be your president and to represent our great association. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. Well, before lunch, I described Cressida Dick as a trailblazer, and that description applies equally well to our next speaker. Born in Rochdale, the son of a bus driver, brother of a police officer, he became a high-flying investment banker before pursuing an equally stellar career in politics. He's been local government secretary, business secretary, culture secretary, and since April, the first person from a BAME background to hold one of the great offices of state as Home Secretary. So please welcome the Home Secretary, Sajid Javid.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today at the Police Superintendents Association's annual conference. Now, before I say anything else, I know what you're thinking, so let me just deal with it right at the start. Yes, I have been watching The Bodyguard. I'm not quite happy with what's happened to the Home Secretary in the latest episode. And no, my code name is not Lavender. Now, I'm probably also feeling a lot more nervous standing up here than Theresa May did when she addressed your conference, I think the last time was 3 years ago. And that's because I've got one guaranteed critic in the audience, and that's my brother. He'll be watching my every move and listening to every word I say. And then I'm sure that as soon as I've got out here and got in my car, my phone will ring and he'll criticize pretty much everything I've said, what he liked, what he didn't like, including the suit I was wearing and things like that.
I'll tell Mum as well.
Don't tell Mum. No, but mind you, I should be taking it on the chin because it's probably because of me that he's got all these thousands of journalists and others following him on Twitter now. People like Kathy. Now, the combination of being Home Secretary and having a Chief Superintendent as a brother has taught me a lot about what it means to be a police super. I know that it's a very important role that you play each and every day managing frontline officers. I know how hard you all work in coming up with the strategic direction for your forces. And I know that how much effort you have to put in every day to fight crime in your communities. The Police Superintendents Association is a very valued government partner. And I am sorry that this conference will be the last that Gavin will attend in his capacity. Since he took over the presidency in 2016, his dedication, his passion, and commitment have been really impressive, and we'll all be sorry to see him go. The association provides constructive advice to the government, and it is a powerful force for change. Now, we haven't always agreed in the past, and of course, we won't always agree in the future. But what I appreciate most about the Police Superintendents Association is the willingness to have those conversations with government and then really make a difference. Conversations about how to improve policing and how to make things better. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. My view on how we can work together to improve policing. Because even though I think my outlook for policing is a bit more optimistic than Gavin, I know that improvements have to be made. Now, many of you will be aware, for example, today of the National Audit Office's report on the financial sustainability of policing. And whilst there are some aspects of the report that I don't quite agree with, it rightly recognises the pressures on policing. When I stood up at the Police Federation conference in May, I said that I will stand with the front line, that I will do all that I can to support your teams, and that I will listen to the police. It is these three principles, standing with you, supporting you, and listening to you, that informs every single decision I make about policing as Home Secretary. Now, you've been telling me that you and your forces are feeling stretched, that the nature of crime is changing, and sometimes you feel that you just can't keep up with it. We all know that the so-called traditional crime is down by a third since 2010, but there are all sorts of other crimes which are being reported more than ever before, and this, of course, is putting huge demands on policing, like hate crimes and child sexual abuse. The threat from terrorism, of course, we've sadly seen has escalated and evolved. And we also know that there are more and more victims of online crime. In fact, you're more likely to be a victim of online crime than offline crime today. There's also been a recent increase, sadly, in serious violence, including homicides, knife, and gun crimes. But all the while, the clamours from the press, from politicians of all parties, and from the public seems to be on you to do more and do more and do more. And as superintendents, you sometimes you must feel that you're being pulled in all sorts of different directions, that you're having to change the strategic direction of your forces to manage new and emerging threats and to adapt your resources accordingly. I want you to feel that you are comfortably equipped to deal with the changing crime landscape. And yes, part of the answer, of course, is resources. That's why, for example, we have invested over £1 billion more in policing each year than we did 3 years ago, including more that's come through council tax. That's why just last week I announced a £21 million extra investment in law enforcement agencies to help fight online child sexual exploitation. That's why as a government we put over £50 million over the next year to boost cyber capabilities, both at a national, regional and local level. And we're also making £40 million available over the next 2 years to support the new serious violence strategy. But despite this increase in funding, I do fully recognise the pressures on policing. So let me be very clear with you. I will continue to fight on the police's behalf so that you have the resources that you need to do your jobs effectively. But making sure that forces are fit for the future isn't just about the finances. You also need to have the tools and the support that you need to do your jobs. Firstly, I think it's vital that you get the training that you've been asking for. As Gavin has already said and just said a moment ago, those of you who work in public protection units sometimes feel that you're thrown in at the deep end without having that necessary training and support that you need. And we've just heard, and it's a truly shocking statistic, Gavin, 87% of those leading units that are there to protect children receive no training or development for that role. This clearly needs to change. I fully support the work that the College of Policing is doing to develop public protection learning program. And my department continues to assist the college to develop the license to practice scheme for people who are working in those high-risk areas. This should mean that no one is put in a position where they're being asked to take on vital public protection roles without adequate preparation. Secondly, you and the men and women that work for you, you need the right powers. One of these powers, for example, is stop and search. I'm consulting on extending stop and search so that officers are able to stop and search anyone that's suspected of carrying acid without good reason. We will all remember, for example, just a few weeks ago, the case of a 3-year-old boy who was seriously hurt when he was the target, a 3-year-old boy, target of an acid attack in Worcester. A month before that, 2 teenage victims were taken to hospital in East London when they were sprayed in the face. Criminals cannot walk around and feel that they can carry dangerous weapons and get away with it. The men and women who work for you, they need to feel comfortable and supported when they are using stop and search. And I've said before, the evidence shows that if you're black, you're more likely to be a homicide victim than any other ethnic group. If stop and search means that lives can be saved from communities that are most affected, then of course it's a very good thing. And as senior leaders, I want you to be able to support your frontline officers to ensure that they are confident in using this important power. Thirdly, you need to feel like you're being rewarded for the work that you do. I know that some of you feel like the roles that you currently have morphed over time. They don't represent or resemble in any way the job that perhaps that you signed up to do many years ago. Perhaps the area that you run has got larger, it's got more complex, the number of people that you manage has gone up. Maybe you're asked to deal with some particular issues that are some of the most challenging without getting all those resources and the other support that you need. The MPCC has submitted proposals, which we just heard of a moment ago, which would allow chief constables to give a discretionary bonus payment of up to £4,000 a year for officers who take on those hard-to-fill roles and for superintendents in especially challenging roles. And today I can announce that I offer my full support to these proposals, and I intend to legislate so that these bonuses can be given out. And I can also confirm that chief constables will be able to authorize these payments to be backdated to the 1st of September 2017. Fourthly, you need to feel like your welfare is being taken seriously. I was disgusted to see a recent video on social media of police officers being kicked from behind on the floor in a McDonald's restaurant. Being beaten up should never be part or considered in any way to be part of the job. I'm in no doubt that those who assault police officers deserve to face very serious consequences. And that's why we support the Assault and Emergency Workers Bill, which doubles the penalty available for low-level assaults on police officers. The bill will receive royal assent this week, and it sends a clear message that attacks on public workers, public sector emergency workers, will not be tolerated. And at the Federation conference, your teams also told me that they want better protection in the form of tasers and spit and bite guards. I've now written to police chiefs across the country stressing the importance of both of these. But it's not just your physical welfare that we need to be thinking about. It's mental health too. The association's most recent resilience survey showed that half of the respondents reported feelings of anxiety. As I made clear at the Police Federation conference, I want us to work together to totally transform the welfare provision for policing. We've already pledged the £7.5 million we heard about a moment ago. That's the new National Police Welfare Service. And today I'm pleased to announce that £400,000 of this money will be used to support the proposal by Chief Constable Andy Rhodes and the College of Policing to get a new wellbeing outreach prevention service on the road starting next month. The first of the fleet of the so-called wellbeing buses will be pulling up outside police stations and providing accessible, stigma-free support and information for anyone who feels that they need it. But I know that sometimes, you as leaders, it can be hard to ask for help. You might be good at signposting support services for others, and yet not very good at taking them up yourself. So I urge you all to prioritize your welfare too and take advantage of the services that are now being offered. Finally, and most importantly, I want you to know that I will listen to you. The frontline review is now underway, and I want you to encourage all of you to encourage the officers that work with you to share their experiences about policing. The Policing Minister, Nick Hurd, has already done a lot of important work in this area, continues to listen, going around the country, and I know there was a session with him earlier today. There are lots of different ways you can get involved, from face-to-face discussions to online conversations. In fact, at the Home Office, from our first Twitter session, we caught the attention of over 40,000 people, and we had some 500 comments within the first hour. So it's clear that there is a lot to say, but I don't want you to leave it to others to get involved. As supers, you're making decisions each and every day on behalf of your forces, and I would love for you to be more involved. If you get a very different sort of insight from the work that you do, from many of your colleagues, and it's important that we hear from that too. So if there's one message I want to leave with you today, then it is this. When you speak, I will listen. The Police Superintendents Association is a great force for good. You are tireless advocates for police superintendents, and you have played a vital role in developing policing. I want this to continue long into the future, and my door will always be open to you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Stay here.
Thank you very much, Home Secretary. I just wanted to start, really, with your pledge to reset the relationship with the police. You've talked about fighting for resources. How can people in this room have any confidence that you'll be able to deliver on that when the Prime Minister has blocked the independent recommendation of a 3% pay rise?
I like it that you started with the easy questions. Yes, thank you very much for that. I think, first of all, I think it would be wrong to say that the Prime Minister has blocked, whether it's pays and things. I mean, all these decisions, they are your collective decisions of government, and that's the fair way to look at it. But I think it's a very valid question, because first of all, dealing with the pay issue, and I'm pleased that Gavin touched on it. It is, Gavin is right when he talks about and mentioned and said to me separately in meetings that if you have an independent pay body, you have it for a very good reason. It's independent for that obvious reason that it's got to go away, do the analysis, make recommendations, and then that has to be taken seriously. And I think particularly taken seriously, more seriously, let's say, even for a service where, as Gavin mentioned, you cannot strike. And I've listened to that. Excuse me. I took it seriously. I've listened to that. And what I have to do at the same time when it comes to pay recommendations, though, you'll know there are pay recommendations across the board for millions of public sector workers. We have to, as government, take them all into account. You're trying to get that balance between the affordability of what's recommended and fairness to taxpayers. And these are collective decisions. And then once we've taken that into account, we then have to, for each of those public forces, go out there and justify that decision. And that's exactly what's happened here. And there were other pay sectors, for example, other boards where those sectors didn't quite get what they wanted either. And this is a reflection of trying to strike that balance. And I'm not pretending it's easy. Your question was then about how do you, given that decision, how can we give more confidence that the resources that are needed will be there? And first of all, I recognise, and something I recognised early on, even before I was Home Secretary, that there is a need for more resources. As I mentioned a moment ago, there has been an increase in resources in the last 3 years. I don't think it's enough, given the challenges and the complexities of the crimes that you're facing. And that's why I've said that the best time, the best way for really me to make a big difference here, and especially to try and move away from some of the year-on-year changes, so annual changes, and move to sort of longer-term settlements, is through the upcoming spending review, which will start next year. And I've already said quite clearly that my priority for me will be policing.
The Home Office said in a letter to Number 10 that 3% pay rise decision was the wrong decision. So can I take from what you've said that it was a collective decision but a wrong decision at the same time?
I'm not going to comment on leaks of public documents.
Can you comment on my question, though? Was it a wrong decision?
I can't comment on leaked public documents.
Okay, so staying on pay, the question here from the app about your bonus payments, you recognise that there is a need for bonus payments, which is welcome, but this will not benefit all officers and does not address the wider pay concerns. How will you address the widely held views that the current pay review mechanism is not fit for purpose and has failed officers for 2 years running?
I think, hopefully I've answered part of that question just a moment ago. I think it would be... I can absolutely first of all understand why officers would be very concerned and upset about the pay outcome, given that it was an independent recommendation. I don't personally think it's a reflection on the body itself. The pay review body has an important job to do, and I think in the ways that it's been set up, it's doing its job. But the ultimate decision then lies with government to whether it accepts that exact recommendation or not. So I think the pressure really shouldn't be on the pay review body itself, but it should rightly be on government, and ministers like me and others should be questioned about how this will be handled in the future.
Gavin, you've got a follow-up?
Yeah, very quick comment on that. I mean, I think, and this is going to sound strange, but it's not necessarily the fact that the award was not made. I think there was a huge frustration in the service of principally unfairness. We can't even negotiate now. And as I said, I use that term procedural injustice. We have nothing at all. We put in a lot of work, evidence-based, to the PRRB process, and then we leave all our faith to that process itself. We've all got mortgages, we've all got families, we've all got bills like everybody else to pay. And I think there's a fundamental fairness issue here. It's not necessarily the outcome of the process. Of course, that's important, but it's more so the actual fairness of the process, which is frustrating not only colleagues in the association, but I think the wider service as well.
Home Secretary, your response to that point on fairness?
No, I understand that. I'm not going to argue with that. I mean, I would, if I was in Gavin's position, anyone's position in the audience, I'd feel exactly the same way as Gavin's just said, and I can't put it better myself. You have an independent process. It takes soundings from police officers and others and makes recommendations. And I think you have good reason to think that those recommendations would be met. Now, I've tried to explain why it was not in this case. As I said, it wasn't only in the case of police. But I understand that. I think it's incumbent on me, especially as a sort of new Home Secretary coming in, to try and win back that confidence, and that's what I'm going to try and do.
And your comments have clearly been welcomed by the audience. There's a question here saying very encouraging, supportive commitments, which is encouraging. How will you bridge our relationship with a government with a Prime Minister both out of touch with the role of the police and with a clear disregard for their value?
Well, I don't think the Prime Minister's out of touch. I think the Prime Minister's got a very difficult, challenging job to do, and whether we're talking about policing, and there's so many other issues at the same time. And she is a Prime Minister, having been Home Secretary, compared to other Prime Ministers who haven't had that role. She's got a particular understanding of policing and crime, and that's something I think that can be used to the advantage of policing and getting the resources that we need.
Let's take some questions from the floor. So stick your hand up, give us a wave. Just here, please, at the front, if we could have the mic over here. Great, thank you.
Ian Wiley, Avon and Somerset. Home Secretary, first of all, may I say how great it is to have a Home Secretary who's got a link to policing, and particularly a link to the Superintendents Association. In terms of the bonus scheme, I very much welcome your announcement, as I'm sure everyone in the room will do the same. However, there will be anxiety that the award will be at the discretion of Chief Constables. And we know that Chief Constables are employers, but they're also the keepers of the purse. And we are expecting significant inequalities in the application of that bonus scheme due to affordability. We think that will further undermine confidence in the pay awards. How can you, as Home Secretary, support our wish that Chief Constables take this pay bonus scheme seriously and apply it fairly?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, when you talk about the link, I think you're talking about the less attractive version of me that's sitting over there.
I'm waiting for a question from him.
Well, that's big. I'm just getting back from the mum comment.
It was a good heckle.
But on the bonuses, so yeah, I was pleased to be able to do that. It does require, so the way it worked, that was a recommendation of the board as well, and it requires legislation for us to allow that to go forward. Our analysis is based, first of all, on an understanding we think Chief Constables, the respective forces, they can afford to do this. And that your question about consistency, I think, is a good one. And when we set out how we're going to approach this alongside the legislation, we also set out some guidelines. And also, I was pleased to be able to have it so that it's backdated to, I think, what the association was looking for, which was the September 2017.
Gavin, did you?
Really welcome. Most of my colleagues will really welcome that. I think our concern will be when it goes out to the 43 organisations, I am not overly optimistic that there's going to be, exactly as Ian's just articulated, that there's going to be a transparent and equitable approach to the allowance itself. And I'll just put this remark at the end. I also would be very interested to see which forces don't regard any superintendent roles as not challenging.
Do you want to respond to that? No?
No,
Okay. Let's have another question from the floor. There's loads coming in on the app. Just here, please, in the pink shirt. Thank you. Great. Thank you. There's one coming closer. Okay.
Nora Holford from Thames Valley. I used to be a public protection superintendent, head of public protection for Thames Valley, and I really welcome your commitment to practice licence for our experts. 2 points. Firstly, is there a commitment also to ensure that the front line can recognise vulnerability and exploitation? Because after all, without them actually seeing what is going on, referring it to us, the specialists don't know where to start. And the second part is, as we've talked about earlier on in the conference, this is not purely a pursue matter. Prosecution is sometimes not the answer. It's not just police services resources that need to be available for us to refer cases to. Is there a commitment from your part to ensure all the other agencies have the capacity and the capability to support those cases and further them forward so that we protect those that are vulnerable?
Thank you, Laura. On your first part about the front line and training to recognise vulnerability and exploitation, I think that's vitally important, and some work in that area has already begun. I've seen some good examples in some forces, but more needs to be done. We are looking and trying to work out what's the best way to do that. For example, the push the government and police have had in the last few years on modern slavery, and how people are being exploited through trafficking and other means, and having police that are trained for that, to spot that, and other public workers. So, for example, with border force officers, we have need for that kind of training, and they can work more effectively with their policing partners. On the second point about it's not just as you said, a issue in terms of pursuing and by police. There are other agencies. I think that is something that hasn't been properly sort of focused on for a while, and that the importance of just that. So, for example, there's too many instances now of police officers that are basically having to deal with mental health issues of the people that they're either pursuing or they're being called out. And I've seen, in the short time I've been Home Secretary, already gone out and seen with police. I've been in cases where they've shown me where they will get called out, they meet someone, and the people you work with every day will be so familiar with this. And the individual clearly has a mental health problem, and that's the number one issue, but they have to stay with that individual for hours and hours until someone turns up from the NHS or mental health authority to look after them. And so that kind of joined up working, I think, more can be done. And we are working on it. I picked mental health and issues, I think, is one of the big areas. And with working with the Health Secretary, that's exactly what the Home Office is trying to do more of, and also using some of the extra funding rightly that was provided to the NHS, promised by the government a few weeks ago, is to make sure that's also being used in the right way, for example, mental health services, but at the same time taking off pressure off other services like the police.
Another question from the app. If there's no more money for policing in the CSR, what will your stance be then? More for less or more for the same?
I'm confident when it's coming to the CSR.
Well, the Chancellor... I want to push you on that, because the Chancellor's Deputy, Liz Truss, said that Cabinet Ministers were demanding, quote, unsustainable, unaffordable and unconservative public spending increases, and that it's not macho to demand more money. So are you just being macho?
No, I don't think she's talking about me. I think she's got other cabinet ministers in mind. Don't know who they are.
She will soon be talking about you if you're so confident that
you're
going to get that money.
But seriously, I think that the issues that have I've certainly seen the evidence in recent months, and obviously the evidence has been there for a while, and so have my colleagues, of the changing nature of crime and therefore the changing nature of the demands on policing. I mentioned earlier some of those more complex crimes. So, for example, I did a speech last week. Some of you may have heard about child sexual exploitation online becoming, sadly, big in scale, big in complexity. We want law enforcement to crack down on that more and more, and it requires more funding, it requires more resources, it requires more experts in that field. And that's both the police and, for example, the National Crime Agency and the work that it does. Historic sexual abuse. It's a good thing that more and more people are coming forward, reporting crimes that may have taken place years ago, but it takes more effort, it takes more resource to look at those online crimes, of other types, cyber crimes, clearly more complex. So, whilst your traditional crime, what we might call traditional crimes that has come down, is these complex crimes have risen. They take more and more police hours to solve and to work on. And also, let's not forget the rest of the criminal justice system. It's not, if there's more resources for policing, but it's not alongside looking at our courts and public prosecutor and stuff like that, then the whole system isn't going to work together the way it should. So I think this whole area needs to be looked at. And I do think, though, within government there's an understanding that it needs to be looked at seriously, and it's exactly why we have spending reviews, is to look across government at all the demands and make sure we have the right priorities.
You said the NAO report rightly recognised the pressures on policing. So can you be explicit? Have the spending cuts had an impact on the ability of the police to tackle crime?
No, I don't think it's that straightforward. Sometimes no, it's not that straightforward, because sometimes take serious violence. It's rightly people are more and more focused on it. We've seen an increase in knifing, and for example, in homicides across our big cities, and especially London, for example. It would be, I think, it would just be too simplistic to say that a fall in funding has led to a rise in serious crime, because in the past I can point to periods where there's been big rises in funding, and there's still been a big rise in crime. So I don't think it's as straightforward to say it's all about resources. That said, I think that you cannot ignore the question about resources, and you have to recognise as an issue, especially when you see a rising complexity in crime.
Gavin?
I just wanted to touch upon the point about the CSR, and the Minister, I think, referred to it this morning. I think we're doing a different approach to this. It's a whole system approach, which I said in my speech this. We, the service, have got to work, and we are working with Home Office colleagues and supporting Home Secretary and the Minister to put forward the best possible case we can do in the next CSR. So it's not an us and them situation. There's a whole system approach. So that work is actually undergoing at the moment. So, in respect, there's a whole system approach in terms of supporting to get the best deal we possibly can for money to get back into the service. There is, however, and I am worried about this, that if we don't get the settlement we want, what is the plan B? And I'm not clear on what that might look like in terms of, do we carry on as we have done for the last 5 or 6 years? Because if we are, I would like to know if you think we could sustain how we've done the previous 5 years the same way again, because I'm not sure we can.
I think we need a change in approach, and so I'm not working on a plan B. I've got plenty of work to do on plan A still. It's coming along well, and your help and others is welcome, but that's what I'm focused on.
Another question. Just here, please, in the pink tie. Yeah, 2 mics. That's police efficiency. Yeah, great.
Thank you. John Saville, I'm also another public protection bod. Online crime, you talked about the reinvestment in, or the added investment in Stop It Now and preventative activity around child abuse images and grooming online. I think many of us would want to understand why we singly cannot fail to get industry to be involved in preventing this. There are trillion-dollar companies around the world who control these platforms to allow these images to be moved around, shared, allow grooming to take place, yet they don't seem to be gripping this and putting in place to stop it, because we can't arrest our way out of it. What's the government doing about that?
Yeah, and I think that's another very good question. And so what I talked about last week was that was just that. When it comes to that crime, a particularly abhorrent crime, which sadly the scale seems to have increased, and it seems to have increased because in the old days, so to speak, is that if there's a paedophile out there wanted to hurt children, generally they had to have some way of coming into contact with children. Now anyone, if they wanted to, they can come into contact, as it were, with children, but through the online world. But they can still cause that abuse, either if they're consuming these images and things, or in the worst cases, I talked about the live streaming of abuse, where they're effectively directing someone else to abuse a child, maybe sitting in Southeast Asia somewhere. But they're still, as far as I'm concerned, they're still responsible for that abuse that's taking place. So that first shows the scale has increased, it's become more complex. And because it's happening on online platforms, there's a role for many people to play. Obviously, that's police, it's us, the government, it's parents as well, being a bit more, in some cases, a bit more careful about what their children are doing, particularly young children online. But very importantly, is the point you made, I think there's a huge role for what I call like the web giants in particular, the big tech sort of web giants. And I know what they can do if they were asked to do it. And the reason I know what they can do is because when I first came into the job, there was a big focus, and my predecessor had it as well, on terrorist content online. And after those 5 horrible terrorist attacks we had last year in our country, there was an ultimatum given to tech companies by Britain and the US and some other countries, but particularly Britain and the US, saying, you better clean up your act and do much more to get this kind of terrorist content offline. Otherwise, we're going to take action. And guess what? Within months, the companies, the big tech companies, they came up with all sorts of ways to do just that, including, for example, stopping the upload of terrorist content in the first place, actually stopping the upload so no one gets to see it. So my view now is if they can do it with terrorist content, they can also do it with child abuse. Because both of those, if you take, there's no debate. There's not a single society on earth that would debate with you about whether that type of content is wrong. Everyone agrees, information on how to make bombs is wrong. Everyone agrees abuse of a child is wrong. There's no debate. And that's why these companies can do it. And you know what? I made the speech on Monday. For a while, the companies, some of them, they have done a bit of work, to be fair, but they weren't taking it seriously enough. And some of them were saying, look, we can't do much more. It's really difficult. I made a speech on Monday, and one of the biggest web companies, I won't name it because they'll come out soon themselves, in a positive way, contacted us the following day and said, look, we just come up with an idea. How about this? And it's a brilliant idea, but it just shows you what they can do. So we will be cracking down a lot more. And I've also been clear, if they don't do it themselves, we're going to legislate.
But how long have they got?
Actually, in my mind, I've only got a few weeks to come up with some ideas. I'm going to see some more of them. But it's a matter of just weeks and not much more than that. We're already preparing legislation anyway and for the cyberspace, and so it's not very difficult for me to make sure that we capture this if we have to.
There's a question from the app. Is the Minister considering, or Home Secretary, considering creating Police England and Police Wales? And just to add to that, the PSA members survey found that 82% of members said force amalgamations should be considered. So will you consider it?
I'm not considering Police England and Police Wales. That said, I do understand why, in some cases, amalgamation can make a lot of sense. Personally, when you look across the spectrum, sort of 43 forces across England and Wales, it's not how you would design a police force. If you're starting with a blank piece of paper, you would not start with 43 or anything like it. We all know historically why we've got here. There's nothing sort of wrong about that. I understand it. But I think there is a case there to have more support for those forces that do wish to merge. We're seeing that in southwest England, for example, at the moment. And it's got some parallels. For example, you mentioned earlier, Kathy, that my job before this was as the local government secretary. And there's some parallels there. If you look at our local government system, it's not how you would design it. All those different councils, some overlapping and things. And I did make some big, bold decisions there. The first unitarizations of councils that have been approved in over almost 20 years. And I did that. And they are big, bold political decisions. That's what you're asking for. Yep. So give me a few options and I might make some more.
There's an invitation. Probably got time for a couple more questions if we're quick. So let's do this one over here. Great.
Afternoon, Phil Davis from Greater Manchester. Home Secretary, I'd like to speak to you a little bit about procurement. So we've got a system in place at the minute where we've got up to 43 forces buying services and technology in a marketplace that is quite happy to sell things 43 times. If we're looking at value for money, would this perhaps be a more fruitful place to look before we start cutting frontline services? I'm just interested on your views on police procurement.
Yeah, I agree with the point. First of all, I think that my understanding is since 2010 there has been some improvement in procurement and sort of collective sort of purchasing power, but it sounds like it hasn't gone far enough. And it's sort of linked to the previous question about some of the efficiencies that can be had. There are some that can be had without sort of formal amalgamations and things, but I think procuring, it makes absolute sense, as it does in many other parts of government, is to procure together, particularly obviously when you're buying the same things.
There was another question, hand shot up just there, yeah, at the back, please. Thank you.
Liz Mead from Bedfordshire. Policing is striving to be representative of the communities that we serve. Do you therefore believe that all police officers should have a degree?
No, I don't. No, I don't think all police officers need to have a degree. I think that, I mean, first of all, your first part of your point about police should be striving to represent the communities they serve, and that's one of the reasons, for example, we have your elected commissioners. That's why in the past the government has worked with police forces to, for example, increase representation for BME communities, but also in terms of a background of individuals and skills. No, I don't think that at all. Now, I think that the College of Policing, they're right to sort of look at these issues and make recommendations, but I think there should be different routes for people to come into policing, including, for example, apprenticeships and other routes. And I think just to have a single route, for example, a degree route, would be wrong.
I just want to say on behalf of everyone in the room, thank you very much to the Home Secretary. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.